Hello and welcome to another episode of the JRE Review, where each week I and my guest will review Joe Rogan Podcast, and we'll look at what is the most interesting podcast of the week, ones that brought up the most questions, maybe the most confusing. I know that a lot of people listen to Joe and people are listening to this one, so it's important that I put out the ones that, in a lot of ways, often are the most confusing. My guest today, since I'm in England for Christmas, is my brother Will. Say hi, Will.
Hello. How you doing?
And the guest that was on Rogan that we're reviewing is podcast 1216, Sir Roger Penrose. Now, Sir Roger Penrose is a pretty fascinating guy, super smart. If you haven't heard this podcast, you've got to check it out. It's a tough one, whether you take notes or not, it's complicated, but it's fascinating. He's like a philosopher of science, PhD, of course. He's been knighted. His work is incredible. He's looked into kind of what makes consciousness, and he has some interesting theories that Joe is kind of really into. And he starts off with something that's pretty fascinating. He talks about what got him into doing this type of thought process and work into consciousness. And it was the fact that he started to notice from these obscure lectures he was going to that you cannot prove everything with math, right? So and you've taken some advanced math class as well, probably along the way, calculus, all the rest of it. So there's a lot of functions. They use functions and the curve, and then it's like this explains why this happens. And then you also have other formulas that prove things. But he's basically saying, from what he understands, and I have no experience with this, that there are certain things that exist in the universe that you can't prove with math.
Unquantifiable.
Yeah.
Craziness. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly unquantified. Like things that even if you punch in all the formulas, it spits out something that says this doesn't make sense. You can't line this up. Like there's nothing that proves it. And that leaves like kind of a complicated point in at least the world of mathematics or physics, because these guys that are very smart are under the impression that you can prove everything, but not necessarily, right? So his idea is consciousness comes into this somehow, right? What we are when we're paying attention to consciousness, it's taking away the idea that consciousness is just another formula, that it's something higher, not necessarily spiritual in a sense, right? But it could be.
It's a manifestation all the same, though.
Sure, it's something that is like. It's just something else. It's an observation of all of the things that we can prove. And the observation point, which is us, in the way that we observe things, is non-provable. Because maybe consciousness is coming from another point. Fascinating.
If a tree falls in the forest, is it heard?
Exactly. Exactly.
Same paradigm.
Exactly. Yeah. So look, with the mic, speak up a little bit in front of it. But it's exactly, if the tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, that brings up the kind of thought process of like simulation theory, right? Where if it is a simulation, if you're playing like The Sims, the stuff goes on all the time even when you're not there. Do you ever play that game?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
What's up on it?
Yeah, so if you're in a different room, stuff's happening, but there's no visual part of it. It's just the numbers crunching.
Yeah.
So, if you go back to someone's house and it's on fire, it wasn't making a noise before that. You had to walk in and observe it. Yeah. Or, so it's along with these sorts of things. So he talks about these things in your brain that are called microtubules, and they're in like every cell, but they're also surrounding all the neurons, and they're like the structure of the things in your brain that he thinks brings consciousness. Weird, right?
Yeah. I need some more explanation on that.
Well, he doesn't really get into at least to where I could understand like why that is, other than like they're this standardized structure. They're the things that pull chromosomes are part in mitosis. They're like this element of life that's incredibly important, and it doesn't divide or change like other cells. It's more standardized. But other than that, honestly, I did not really I don't think he doesn't know 100% that this is related to consciousness. This is just his theory. And I don't think he's done like math
personal theory, or it's peer reviewed, or is it like what extent are we talking?
He's written some papers on it, and he has some colleagues out of like Poland and other things, and they speculate, but he's not a biologist, so he's coming from a different point of thought. But there are some theories out there that's saying like this might be the element. So when you're thinking of consciousness in a way, you've got to think of the consistencies of what is like in the brain or in the cell, and then what things are changing. So what is just like fueling the creature, what is just keeping all the functionality, the blood flowing, the heart going, all the rest of it, and what is different. What is there just for the brain? What is there just to allow thoughts move from one point of the brain to another in the fashion that makes up what we think consciousness is? And what really is, I guess, the scaffolding for it. And that's where these things come in. So I think he's coming from the point of like a scaffolding, which...
That's what we all strive towards, really understanding that these mechanics.
Oh, of course. It's got to be the biggest question of all time. Like, why do we even think about anything or know what we are? But I found that kind of fascinating. I don't know how they came to that conclusion, but, but in the same way, when Joe is talking to Sir Roger Penrose, he says you got to be careful because when you talk consciousness, you get into the area of like woo, crystals, fucking, star signs and all the rest of it. It's like you've got to be very careful.
There's no metric.
No, there isn't. And people like to just throw that stuff out and say, oh, it comes from your deeper meaning and blah, blah, blah. And then it's hard to cross that boundary between science and that kind of spirituality thing. And then, there was that movie, What the Bleep Do You Know? Did you ever see that? Yeah, which was mostly bullshit, made by a cult leader. And it was like something that made people think that was science, and most of it was dog shit. And when you have that, I remember first watching, I thought it was fascinating. I was like, no way is that happening. Well, most of it didn't. It was utter shit. So you do need people out there that are legit, that kind of
step in counter opinion and
that step into the world of woo, but are not afraid to kind of do their best to back it up with science, because otherwise it's just a bullshit opinion that goes nowhere. The next part is he steps into talking about quantum mechanics, which is always like a fascinating portion of any understanding that only really intelligent people understand, and even when they do, they can't describe it. But he talks about certain parts of quantum mechanics that are really fascinating. One is quantum entanglement. Do you know much about that?
Touch.
Right. So it's basically where two atoms will sync up, and one will move in a way that the other one does the same in, and you can separate them over vast distances. And the idea is it's an infinite distance. So you could put one on Mars, one on Earth, and have instant communication. With a machine that could like read their movement. Measure, right? Exactly.
Sure.
We don't have any of that yet, but at least we know the process potentially. And he was saying, I guess the world record is like we moved one like 100 miles away, and we could see that the movements were the same. But it's not like we have some sort of Morse code device connected to it. We're talking like lefts and rights. That's all we see. But there's something, and then there's another one called superposition, which is maybe more well known, but it's just about how the electron or whatever you measure could be in any position, right? As well as also
Schrödinger cut.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, like the cat's dead but alive at the same time, which is multiple things, and it's complicated, and it doesn't really necessarily mean it's like alive or dead. It just means that like, in a sense, the choice hasn't been made before it's observed, which is very strange. Yeah, that's a very strange aspect. And then the universe, it's ever expanding. That's hard for people to wrap their heads around. Because what does it expand into? Like, how do you, when someone says to you the universe is infinite, how do you perceive the universe?
Derived from a sense of purpose of an individual is what we all generally try and do.
Right, but where is it going? Like, do you think about it as like it's infinitely big already, or it's getting larger, or like how does your mind answer that when you hear that question?
That's an interesting one. I think we all strive for a sense of purpose, so I guess it is rapidly expanding is the most positive point of view on that.
Yeah, but what do you think it expands into? It's so weird, right?
It's like, yeah, we have to apply our own sense of purpose and meaning and existence in the world to actually being able to kind of pretend we have an aspiration to
understand that question.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's wild. And some of the other theories are like the multiverse, for example, where every decision you make, another decision could have been made, and then in the universe splits off from there and infinite existences happen. He's not feeling that one, and I have to say, knowing nothing about anything even close to this, I'm glad that he feels that way, because I've never liked that one.
No,
because it really
pre-subscribed. No, absolutely not.
Well, it takes all of the
fun out of it.
Well, it takes. You can't take credit for any of your actions if you're just one of an infinite amount of decision making. Yeah. I mean, it makes it really boring if that's the case. So he doesn't believe that's there. But what he does see is he sees some accidents in the universe that make us kind of support that theory. And accidents being inconsistencies to what we think should be there. Like, for example, the neutron is slightly heavier than the proton, which is kind of odd. And the idea might be that, well, hold on, maybe there's a universe where they both weigh exactly the same and things measure up differently, and then therefore different things happen. And beyond that, they talk about alien life. Why haven't we heard from alien life? Well, they could be too fucking far away. But if they have been around long enough, how much longer would it take us to be like...
How long have they been watching us to realise that they don't want to be friends?
Well, that might be it, right? Yeah, that could be it. And that's what the UFO conspiracy theorists surely believe, because they're like, you know what? They come all the time and they don't want to talk to us. But in a way, if they're coming here, it's probably drones anyway. There's probably not creatures in there. Like, we're already sending drones out. We send out like the Voyager things and other, like, why would we even need to be in there? Yeah. Especially if you didn't want the Earthlings to know you were going to the planet. But at the same point, he's saying, well, maybe we're the oldest living things in the universe. That could be it too.
Such an arrogance.
Well, yeah, right. But it also, at least from what we know, it's supported. You can't assume that it's not. So one really interesting theory that he threw out that I thought was fantastic was that the universes repeat. So the Big Bang happens, the universe expands, spreads out, all the energy is lost, and then it loses its gravitational push, sucks back in,
tension.
And then another Big Bang happens. Yeah. So he was saying there's a possibility that a life form could be so advanced, it could leave something that when the universe sucked back in, once it knows all the calculations, it could leave a message for the next universe that expands through space like that background radiation, and somehow it has a message in there.
Signature.
Yeah. Yeah. If it did, and we calculated it, and then we figured out what it was, it would be really fucking depressing, whatever the message is. I guarantee it.
Really?
I just think it would be. What do you think they're going to say? It's great hanging that. No, it's
New Year podcast. You've got to have some positive aspirations.
Maybe, but what are they going to tell us? Leave another message. Tell them to hang in there. Keep your chin up. I mean, what are you going to say?
So stiff upper lip.
Yeah. Leave some instructions on how to build a really cool computer. I mean, there's no point leaving any technology. You're just trying to leave a message that is like the information that you know. And it's like, I don't know. Well, I'm too dumb to even think about what they should put together. But what would they even say? I think it's going to be like, this continues for a long time. Hang in there. Right? This just keeps going.
It's a mixture of comforting.
We look like frogs. What do you look like? Yeah, I don't know. It's just like, what are they even going to pass that would be worth it? But maybe there could be a message from the Big Bang that's left there forever. And, you know, towards the end of their podcast, Joe brings up an interesting quote from J.D.S. Haldane, and he goes, "The world is not only queer as you suppose, it is queerer than you can suppose." That's cool, right?
I like that.
That's a really cool message that they left. But you know, the takeaway is, like, obviously there are some really fucking smart people out there, and if you're smart enough to understand what he's saying when you listen to this podcast, my hat is off to you. He was a fascinating dude to listen to, and hearing Joe kind of, like, you know, give his end of it and try and make sense of what's happening was awesome. And it's definitely worth listening to. It's one of those things, especially come the new year, to kind of sit back and reflect on and just take a moment and look up into the stars, you know, get a space where hopefully you don't have a bunch of lights giving you a bunch of feedback that makes it impossible to see the Milky Way. Hopefully you got a good view, like you're out in Montana somewhere.
2 overbearing family members that are just gonna
take a break from it all, and just, it's the end of the year. Reflect on where you are and what you're doing, and understand, sure, you're a small speck, but you're an important part of all the things. I want to thank my brother Will for helping me out, and he's also a badass sound engineer, so hopefully he's going to teach me a thing or two about making the sound better on my podcast, which I promise to put that effort into, you guys. And thank you so much. Merry Christmas. Have a happy new year. Thanks for downloading, and we will talk more next year, 2019. Thanks, folks. Say bye, Will.
Goodbye.